Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us, click the like button, and let's get into the case. The morning air hung thick with salt and possibility as Dr. Emma Larson stepped onto the dock at Friday Harbor. At 28, she already commanded respect in her field, having dedicated the past decade of her life to studying the orcas of the Salish Sea. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes scanned the horizon with practiced intensity. The early September sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks beneath her feet, and she inhaled deeply, centering herself before the day ahead. "Morning, Dr. Larson," called a familiar voice. Captain Mike Brennan waved from the helm of the Salish Explorer, the 40-foot research vessel that served as Emma's primary workplace. Mike had been navigating these waters for over 30 years, his weathered face a testament to thousands of days spent under the Pacific Northwest sun. Waters like glass today, perfect conditions. Emma smiled and quickened her pace. "Morning, Mike. Any reports come in overnight?" Teapot was spotted near Lime Kiln yesterday evening, moving north. Sounds like they were on the hunt. Mike's eyes crinkled at the corners as he spoke. The transient orcas, or Big's killer whales as they were scientifically known, were mammal hunters, unlike their resident counterparts who primarily fed on salmon. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," Emma replied, stepping aboard and immediately checking her equipment. The hydrophones were already prepped, their underwater microphones ready to capture the complex vocalizations of the hunting orcas. Her drone batteries were fully charged, and her notebooks were organized in waterproof cases. The research center had been tracking unusual behavioral patterns in the transient pods over the past several months. Increased aggression during hunts, expanded territories, and more frequent interactions with boats had all been documented. Today's expedition served a dual purpose: to gather more data for Emma's ongoing research and to provide an educational experience for the 12 tourists who had paid handsomely for an up-close encounter with the ocean's apex predators. "Coffee's in the galley," Mike said, noticing Emma's slight yawn. "Lily's already down there reviewing yesterday's footage." Emma nodded gratefully and made her way below deck. Lily Parker, her 24-year-old graduate assistant, sat hunched over a laptop, her dark eyebrows furrowed in concentration. A cup of coffee cooled untouched at her elbow. "Morning, Lily. Find anything interesting?" Lily jumped slightly, then grinned. "Morning. Just reviewing the drone footage from yesterday. Look at this." She turned the screen toward Emma, revealing crystal clear footage of 3 transient orcas coordinating to create a wave that washed a harbor seal off an ice floe. "T-37A, you know, Raven. He's leading the hunt. And look at his approach pattern." Emma leaned closer, instantly focused. "He's coming in from below, steeper angle than usual." She reached for the touchpad, rewinding the footage. "And look at the tail slap. That's excessive force for a seal this size." Raven, as the researchers had nicknamed the distinctively marked male orca, had been on Emma's radar for months. At approximately 20 years old, he was in the prime of his life and had been displaying increasingly bold behavior. While Emma was careful not to anthropomorphize the animals she studied, there was something about Raven that suggested an unusual intelligence, a calculating nature that set him apart even among these highly intelligent animals. "He's been showing up in all the unusual encounter reports," Lily noted, pulling up a data spreadsheet. 6 of the 8 close approaches to vessels in the past month involved his pod, and he was the primary instigator in each case. Emma frowned. "Any direct contact?" "Nothing significant. A few bumps reported by kayakers near Shore Island, but nothing aggressive. Just curious, intense." Lily took a sip of her now cold coffee and grimaced. "Let's make sure the group stays clear if we encounter his pod today. I'd rather observe from a distance." Emma hesitated, then added, "And prep the small boat. If we get a chance, I want to get a bit closer with the hydrophone array. Not close enough to disturb them, but enough to get better audio of their hunting calls." Lily raised her eyebrows. "You sure after these reports?" Emma nodded firmly. "We'll be cautious, but this could be our chance to document what's driving these behavioral changes. The more data we have, the better we can protect both the orcas and the people who share these waters. The sound of voices above signaled the arrival of their tour group. Emma closed the laptop and straightened her San Juan Marine Research Center jacket. Let's go greet our guests, shall we? The tour group was the usual mix, a retired couple from Minnesota with expensive camera equipment and matching Tilly hats, a family of 4 with teenage children glued to their phones, a young couple on what appeared to be a honeymoon, 3 women friends in their 50s who described themselves as whale enthusiasts, and a quiet man in his 30s who introduced himself as Daniel Henderson, a high school biology teacher from Seattle. "Welcome aboard the Salish Explorer," Emma began, falling easily into her well-practiced introduction. "I'm Dr. Emma Larson, lead researcher at the San Juan Marine Research Center, and this is Lily Parker, our graduate researcher. We're joined today by Captain Mike Brennan, who has over 30 years of experience navigating these waters." As Emma explained the day's itinerary and the safety protocols, she felt the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that accompanied each expedition. These tours funded crucial research, but they also placed visitors in proximity to wild, powerful animals. Finding the balance between meaningful encounters and respectful distance was an ongoing challenge. "Remember, we are guests in their home," Emma emphasized. "We'll maintain the legally required distance of 200 yards from any orcas we encounter, using our powerful zoom lenses and hydrophones to experience these incredible animals without disturbing them." As Mike guided the vessel out of the harbor and into the open waters of the Salish Sea, Emma felt the familiar calming effect of the ocean. The research vessel cut smoothly through the glassy surface, leaving a white wake behind them. The San Juan Islands rose like emerald jewels from the sapphire water, their shores lined with Douglas firs that reached toward the cloudless sky. "Dr. Larson," called Daniel, the biology teacher, as they cleared the harbor, "I read your recent paper on the changing vocalization patterns in transient orcas. Do you think these changes are related to the increased vessel traffic in the Sound?" Emma turned, pleasantly surprised by the question. "That's one hypothesis we're exploring. The acoustic environment has certainly changed dramatically in these waters over the past decades, but we're also looking at prey distribution changes, possible effects of contaminants on brain development, and even cultural transmission of new behaviors within pods." Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's excited voice. "Portside. Humpback at 2 o'clock." The group rushed to the railing as a massive humpback whale breached in the distance, its body momentarily suspended in air before crashing back into the water with a spectacular splash. Cameras clicked rapidly as the whale breached again, then disappeared beneath the surface. "That's Snowflake," Emma explained, recognizing the distinctive white pattern on the whale's fluke. "She's been visiting these waters for at least 15 years. Humpbacks were once rare in the Salish Sea, but they've been returning in increasing numbers over the past decade." The morning continued with several more wildlife sightings: a group of stellar sea lions lounging on a rocky outcropping, a bald eagle soaring overhead, and a playful pod of Dahl's porpoises that briefly rode the bow wave of the vessel. But the orcas remained elusive. By midday, Emma was beginning to wonder if they would encounter any killer whales at all. The tour group remained engaged, fascinated by Emma's explanations of the complex ecosystem of the Salish Sea, but she could sense their underlying disappointment at the absence of the day's main attraction. She was preparing to suggest they break for lunch when Mike's voice crackled over the intercom. "Orca sighting reported near Harrow Strait, moving south. Teapot by the looks of it. We're changing course." A ripple of excitement passed through the group. Emma grabbed her binoculars and joined Mike in the wheelhouse. "How many?" "Report says 5 or 6. Hunting behavior observed." Mike adjusted their course, his experienced hands steady on the wheel. "Should intercept their path in about 20 minutes if they maintain direction." Emma nodded, her heart rate accelerating slightly. "Let's prep the drone and hydrophones. Lily, can you make sure everyone's ready but calm? We don't want excited voices carrying over the water." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Emma checked and rechecked her equipment, ensuring everything was ready to capture valuable data. When Mike finally cut the engines to a near-silent idle, the anticipation on the boat was palpable. At first, there was nothing but the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Then, approximately 300 yards to starboard, a tall black dorsal fin sliced through the water. "There," gasped one of the tourists, pointing. More fins appeared, 5 in total, moving in a tight formation. Even from this distance, Emma could identify Raven by his distinctive 6-foot dorsal fin with the slight rightward cant at the tip. He was accompanied by 2 adult females and 2 younger orcas. Their synchronized movements suggested a coordinated hunt. Emma quickly deployed the hydrophone, slipping the underwater microphone beneath the surface. Within seconds, the haunting clicks, whistles, and pulsed. Calls of the orcas filled the boat's speakers. Unlike the chatty resident orcas, transients hunted in near silence, communicating with subtle, infrequent vocalizations to avoid alerting their prey. The sounds they were hearing now indicated the pod was in the final stages of a hunt. "Lily drone," Emma directed quietly. Lily nodded and carefully launched the small aircraft, its electric motors barely audible as it rose into the sky. Within moments, the drone's live feed appeared on the monitor, showing a bird's-eye view of the unfolding drama. A stellar sea lion was swimming frantically, trying to escape the approaching predators. The orcas had it surrounded, pushing it away from the safety of nearby rocks. The largest orca, Raven, hung back slightly, seemingly directing the others as they herded their prey. "They're using a carousel feeding strategy," Emma narrated, softly to the group. "They'll take turns pursuing the sea lion to tire it out, while the others block escape routes. It's a highly coordinated hunting technique that demonstrates their remarkable intelligence and social cooperation." The tourists watched in hushed fascination as the hunt progressed. The sea lion fought valiantly, making several desperate lunges toward safety, only to be cut off by the circling predators. Then, in a sudden burst of speed, Raven surged forward, disappearing beneath the surface directly below the sea lion. A moment later, the sea was stained red. The sea lion had vanished. "Did he just take it under?" asked one of the teenagers, eyes wide. Emma nodded. Transient orcas often pull their prey underwater to drown it before consuming it. They typically share the food among the entire pod. As if to illustrate her point, the orcas began surfacing in a tight group, rolling and socializing as they presumably shared their meal beneath the surface. The drone footage showed occasional flashes of the sea lion's remains as the orcas tore it apart. "Notice how differently they behave compared to resident orcas," Emma continued, maintaining her educational tone despite the raw nature of what they were witnessing. "Residents are highly vocal and feed primarily on salmon. These transient orcas have evolved completely different hunting strategies and social behaviors to pursue marine mammals." The group watched for nearly 40 minutes as the orcas finished their meal and began more active social behavior, spy-hopping to look above the surface, slapping their tails on the water, and even breaching occasionally. Raven was particularly active, his massive body launching completely clear of the water before crashing back down with tremendous splashes. It was during one of these dynamic displays that Emma noticed something unusual. After a particularly high breach, Raven surfaced and remained stationary, his head raised slightly out of the water in a spy-hop position. He appeared to be looking directly at their vessel. "That's unusual," Emma murmured to Lily. "He's showing focused attention on us." Lily zoomed the drone camera. "Is he assessing us?" Before Emma could respond, Raven submerged, and a moment later, the entire pod changed direction, now swimming directly toward the Salish explorer. "Mike," Emma called, trying to keep her voice casual to avoid alarming the tourists. "Let's increase our distance a bit." Mike nodded and gently engaged the engines, beginning to move the vessel away from the approaching orcas. But the pod changed course to match them, maintaining a direct approach. "They're following us," Lily said, her voice tight with concern. Emma watched through her binoculars as the orcas closed the distance with powerful tail strokes. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Orcas sometimes showed curiosity about vessels, but the directness of their approach and the intensity of their focus raised alarm bells in Emma's mind. "Mike, let's make it a bit more obvious we're moving. "Away," she suggested, and felt the engines surge as the captain increased their speed. The Orcas responded by accelerating as well, easily keeping pace with the vessel. The distance between them had shrunk to approximately 150 yards, closer than the legally mandated separation. "What's happening?" asked one of the tourist women, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "The pod is showing some curiosity about our vessel," Emma explained calmly. "This happens occasionally, but we're going to maintain our distance out of respect for their space." But the Orcas were not cooperating with this plan. Despite the vessel's continued movement away, they closed to within 100 yards, then 75. Raven led the charge, his massive dorsal fin cutting through the water like a black sail. "Mike, full speed," Emma said quietly, no longer worried about alarming the guests. Something about this encounter felt different from the typical curious approaches she had experienced in the past. The vessel surged forward, its engines rumbling as Mike opened the throttle. For a moment it seemed they would outpace the Orcas. Then, with powerful tail strokes that sent white spray into the air, the pod accelerated again, keeping pace effortlessly. "They're herding us," Lily realized aloud, watching the drone footage. The Orcas had spread out in a semicircle behind the boat, using the same formation they had employed with the sea lion earlier. Emma's scientific mind raced through possibilities. Territorial display? Protection of a food source? Simple curiosity that had escalated into a chase game? Whatever the motivation, the behavior was concerning. "We need to change tactics," she told Mike. "Cut engines. Let's drift and see if they lose interest when we're no longer moving." Mike complied, throttling down until the vessel bobbed quietly on the waves. The sudden silence was unnerving after the roar of the engines. The Orcas slowed their approach, but continued to advance. At 50 yards, they began circling the vessel, their massive bodies occasionally visible beneath the surface, as dark shadows gliding through the blue water. Emma's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but her scientific training demanded data before conclusions. "Lily, keep the drone on them. I'm going to deploy the directional hydrophone to see if we can pick up any vocalizations." As she prepared the equipment, Emma became aware of the tension among the tour group. The initial excitement had given way to unease as the predators circled their boat like a medieval war party scouting castle defenses. "Are we in danger?" asked the mother of the teenage children, her arm protectively around her daughter's shoulders. Emma chose her words carefully. Orcas are incredibly intelligent and naturally curious animals. In the wild, there has never been a confirmed fatal attack on a human. They're assessing us, not threatening us. She believed what she was saying, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. The behavior they were witnessing fell outside normal parameters. The directional hydrophone picked up increased vocalizations among the pod, short, pulse-like sounds that confirmed they were communicating about this encounter. Emma wished she could understand their complex language, decode what they were planning. Suddenly, Raven broke from the circling pattern and approached the boat directly. He spy-hopped just 20 yards from the bow, his massive head rising vertically. From the water, one black eye clearly visible as he regarded the humans watching him. Several tourists gasped. Even Emma, who had witnessed thousands of orca behaviors over the years, felt a chill run through her at the deliberate nature of the assessment. "He's trying to decide what we are," she found herself saying. "Whether we're a threat, prey, or something else entirely." As if hearing her words, Raven sank back beneath the surface. For several long moments there was no sign of him or the other orcas. The surface of the water was unnaturally still. "Where did they go?" whispered one of the whale enthusiasts. Emma checked the drone footage, scanning the water around them. The orcas had vanished from visual range. She listened intently to the hydrophone, but it had gone silent as well. "They may have lost interest," she said cautiously, but something told her this encounter wasn't over. She was right. Without warning, the vessel suddenly rocked violently, nearly throwing several people off their feet. Something massive had struck them from below. "What was that?" demanded Mike from the wheelhouse, his normally unflappable demeanor shaken. Before Emma could respond, it happened again. a powerful impact from beneath that made the entire boat shudder. There was no mistaking the cause. At least one of the orcas was deliberately ramming the hull. "Everyone, hold on to something secure," Emma directed, her voice firm but controlled. "Mike, engines on. Get us out of here." As the engines roared to life, Emma caught a glimpse of Raven surfacing alongside the vessel, so close she could see the scratches on his rostrum, the detailed pattern of his eye patch. For a brief moment, their eyes met, her green human eyes locking with his dark, inscrutable gaze. In that instant, Emma felt something she had never experienced in all her years of research. She felt assessed, measured, and somehow found wanting. The vessel lurched forward as Mike pushed the throttle to maximum. The sudden movement seemed to excite the orcas, who matched their speed with apparent ease, dancing through the wake with fluid grace. "The drone's showing unusual coordination," Lily reported tensely. "They're positioning themselves strategically around us." Emma watched the monitor with growing concern. The pod had formed a precise formation, 2 orcas on each side of the vessel, with Raven directly behind them. It was a hunting formation, adapted for a prey much larger than their usual targets. "Mike, head for that narrow channel between Shaw and Orca's Islands," Emma directed. "The water's shallower there. They might be reluctant to follow." As the vessel changed course, the orcas adjusted seamlessly, maintaining their positions. Another impact rocked the boat, this time from the port side. "They're testing the hull, looking for structural weaknesses," Emma realized aloud. Her scientific mind continued to analyze, even as a more primal part of her brain recognized the danger they were in. The tourists were now openly frightened, holding onto railings, and each other as the boat sped through the water, pursued by the determined predators. The biology teacher, Daniel, had moved to Emma's side, his face pale but his voice steady. "This isn't normal behavior, is it?" he asked quietly. Emma shook her head slightly. "No, this is unprecedented." Another hard impact, and a sound of splintering fiberglass from below. "We're taking on water in the port storage compartment," Mike called from the wheelhouse, his voice tense but professional. "Not critical yet, but we need to reach shore soon." Emma made a rapid decision. "Mike, make for that small cove on Shore Island. We can beach the boat if necessary." As they altered course toward the nearby island, Emma noticed the orcas adjusting their tactics. 2 of them accelerated ahead of the vessel, potentially to cut off their path, while Raven and the others continued their pursuit from behind. "They're herding us away from the island," Lily observed, watching the drone footage. "They're actually anticipating our escape route." Emma felt a chill run through her body that had nothing to do with the September air. The level of strategic thinking they were witnessing suggested not just instinctive behavior, but calculated action, a coordinated effort to isolate their target. "New plan," she announced. "We're going to make a wide circle and head back toward Friday Harbor. There will be other vessels there, more people." Mike nodded grimly and began the turn. As the boat heeled to starboard, another powerful impact struck them directly amidships. This time, the hull breach was significant. Warning alarms blared from the wheelhouse. "Taking on water in the main compartment," Mike reported, his voice now urgent. "We need to deploy emergency procedures." Emma took command of the situation. "Everyone, put on life jackets immediately." She turned to Lily. "Radio the Coast Guard. Give them our exact coordinates and situation." As the group scrambled to comply, Emma made another rapid assessment. The nearest island was still over a mile away, too far to reach before the vessel became dangerously compromised. Other boats were visible in the distance, but none close enough to provide immediate assistance. Another impact rocked the vessel, and this time the engines sputtered and died. "Fuel lines been severed," Mike reported grimly. "We're dead in the water." The silence that followed was deafening. Without the engine noise, they could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, and the increasingly urgent sound of water flooding into the lower compartments. "Coast Guard acknowledges," Lily reported. "Vessels being dispatched. ETA. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Emma looked out at the circling orcas, their dorsal fins slicing through the water like obsidian blades. Would the vessel stay afloat that long? Would the orcas maintain their current behavior, or would they escalate further? She made a difficult decision. We need to deploy the life raft, but stay with the vessel as long as possible. Water entry should be our last resort. She didn't need to explain why. Everyone aboard understood that being in the water with hunting orcas was a scenario to be avoided at all costs. As Mike and Daniel worked to deploy the emergency life raft, Emma continued to observe the orcas. Their circling had tightened, bringing them within meters of the stricken vessel. Raven repeatedly swam directly under the boat, his massive body occasionally bumping the hull with what felt like deliberate restraint. Not hard enough to cause further damage, but a reminder of the power he could unleash. "Why are they doing this?" asked one of the teenage boys, his earlier boredom replaced by wide-eyed fear. Emma wished she had a simple answer. Orcas are apex predators with complex behaviors we don't fully understand. This pod may be territorial or protecting a food. So, she hesitated, reluctant to voice her growing suspicion. "Or what?" pressed the boy's father. "Or they may be treating us as prey," Emma admitted quietly, testing our defenses before deciding how to proceed. A heavy silence fell over the group. The life raft was now deployed and secured alongside the vessel, ready for rapid boarding if necessary. "The boat's taking on water too quickly," Mike announced from below deck, where he had been checking the extent of the damage. "We have maybe 10 minutes before we have a serious problem." Emma nodded, her mind racing through options. The Coast Guard wouldn't arrive in time. They needed to buy minutes any way they could. "I have an idea," she said suddenly. "The acoustic deterrent device. We use it to keep orcas away from salmon farms." Lily understood immediately. "The high-frequency emitter. It's in the research locker." "Get it," Emma directed. "If we can drive them back even temporarily, it might give us enough time." As Lily hurried below, Emma continued to watch Raven. The massive orca had ceased his passes beneath the boat and was now stationary off the port side, his head partially raised out of the water, watching them with that same unsettling intentionality she had noticed earlier. The vessel listed further to port as water continued to flood the lower compartments. The tour group had clustered near the life raft, their earlier excitement about witnessing wildlife completely forgotten in the face of genuine fear. Lily returned with a small waterproof case. "Got it." Emma took the device, a specialized underwater speaker designed to emit sounds that orcas found aversive without causing them harm. It was used primarily in research contexts and had variable effectiveness, but it was the only deterrent tool they had available. "I'll deploy it from the research platform," Emma decided, referring to the small extendable deck at the stern used for equipment deployment. "That's too exposed," Lily protested. "Let me do it." Emma shook her head firmly. "I know exactly which frequencies to use for transients. It has to be me." Before further objections could be raised, she made her way carefully across the tilting deck to the stern platform. Activating the device, she adjusted the settings to produce the specific high-frequency sounds that research had shown could deter transient orcas. As she extended the device into the water on its cable, Emma was acutely aware of her vulnerable position. The platform placed her just 2 feet above the water's surface, outside the main protective hull of the vessel. If an orca chose to investigate closely, there would be nothing between them. The device activated with a soft hum, sending invisible sound waves through the water. For several tense moments, there was no visible reaction from the circling orcas. Then, gradually, they began to widen their circle, moving away from the immediate vicinity of the boat. "It's working," Lily called from the main deck. "They're retreating." Emma allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The acoustic deterrent wasn't harmful to the orcas, just irritating, like a high-pitched noise that humans would find uncomfortable. If it could drive them back even 100 yards, it might buy enough time for the Coast Guard to arrive. Her relief was short-lived. As she began to retract the device, a massive black shape surged from the water directly in front of her. Raven had breached less than 10 feet from the research platform, his entire body momentarily suspended in air before crashing back down with a tremendous splash that drenched Emma in cold seawater. She gasped and stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing on the wet platform. Before she could recover, Raven surfaced again, this time directly alongside the platform. His massive head rose from the water, eye level with Emma's position. For the second time that day, she found herself looking directly into the orcas, but now from a distance of mere feet rather than yards. Time seemed to stop as predator and researcher regarded each other. Emma's scientific mind noted the perfect hydrodynamic shape of his head, the precise pattern of his eye patch, the few small scars that marked his otherwise sleek skin. The more primal part of her brain registered his size, his power, and the complete lack of fear he displayed. "Emma, get back inside now!" Mike's voice shattered the moment. Before she could move, Raven sank beneath the surface. The water around the platform went eerily still. Emma felt rather than saw the massive shape, passing directly beneath her. Survival instinct screamed at her to run, but training held her in place. Sudden movements might trigger predatory responses. Slowly, deliberately, she began to back away. From the edge of the platform, she had taken only 2 steps when Raven struck. The entire research platform lurched upward as the Orca rammed it from below with tremendous force. Emma was thrown off her feet, tumbling backward toward the main. For a moment, she thought she had escaped the worst. Then the platform collapsed. Metal supports twisted and tore as the Orca's massive body drove upward with unstoppable force. Emma felt herself falling as the decking gave way beneath her. There was a brief, disorienting moment of weightlessness, and then the shocking cold of the ocean enveloped her. Underwater, Emma's training kicked in automatically. Don't panic. Establish orientation. Find the surface. She fought through the initial shock of cold water and the adrenaline flooding her system, forcing her body to respond to her mind's commands. She kicked toward what she hoped was the surface, her vision nothing but a blur of bubbles and refracted light. Her lungs began to burn as precious seconds passed. Just as she feared she had misjudged the direction, her head broke the surface, and she gasped in a desperate breath of air. "Emma!" Lily's scream cut through the ringing in her ears. The Salish explorer was less than 15 feet away, its stern now visibly damaged where the research platform had been. Emma began to swim toward the vessel, powerful strokes propelling her through the water. She had covered perhaps half the distance when she felt it, a subtle pressure wave in the water, a displacement that signaled a large body moving rapidly in her direction. She didn't waste energy looking back. Every cell in her body focused on reaching the vessel, where Mike and Daniel were leaning over the side, arms extended to pull her aboard. 5 more strokes. 4. 3. Something solid brushed against her legs, a glancing contact that could have been coincidental but felt deliberately restrained. Emma kicked harder, her arms reaching desperately for the hands extended toward her. 2 more strokes. 1. Her fingertips touched Daniel's outstretched hand, just as the water beneath her surged upward. A massive force lifted her partially out of the water, and she felt the unmistakable smooth, rubbery texture of an orca's rostrum against her back. Emma screamed, a sound born of primal terror rather than conscious thought. Her hands clutched frantically at Daniel's, and she felt his grip tighten as Mike also grabbed her arm. Together they pulled as the orca lifted her further out of the water. For one nightmarish moment, Emma was suspended between 2 forces, the humans pulling her toward safety and the massive predator rising beneath her. She felt the orca's hot breath on her legs as its blowhole expelled air. Then, with a final desperate effort, Mike and Daniel heaved, and Emma tumbled over the railing onto the deck of the vessel. She scrambled away from the edge, gasping and shaking. Through the gap where the research platform had been, she saw Raven surface, his dorsal fin standing tall as he circled once, twice, and then dove deep, disappearing from sight. The next moments were a blur of activity. The vessel was now listing dangerously to port, the lower compartments almost completely flooded. Mike ordered everyone into the life raft, the women and children first, followed by the men. Emma, despite her ordeal, helped coordinate the evacuation, her professional responsibilities temporarily overriding her personal shock. By the time everyone was safely aboard the raft, the Salish explorer was riding dangerously low in the water. Mike was the last to leave the vessel, bringing the emergency radio and positioning beacon with him. "Coast Guard's 5 minutes out," he reported grimly as he joined them in the crowded raft. "Everyone stay calm and still. No sudden movements." Emma, huddled beneath an emergency blanket provided by Lily, scanned the water around them. The orcas were still present, but maintaining distance, their dorsal fins visible as they patrolled in a wide circle around the sinking vessel and life raft. "Why aren't they leaving?" whispered one of the women. "They got what they wanted, didn't they? They sank the boat." Emma had no easy answer. In all her years of research, all her studies of orca behavior, she had never encountered or even heard of an incident like this, a seemingly deliberate, coordinated attack on a vessel. It defied scientific explanation within the current understanding of killer whale behavior. "They're probably just curious now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her chattering teeth and racing heart. "They're intelligent animals. They want to observe the outcomes of their actions." Whether her explanation was accurate or merely comfortable fiction, the orcas maintained their distance as the minutes crawled by. Emma used the time to check herself for injuries. Her right leg was bleeding from a long scrape, possibly from contact with the collapsing platform or perhaps from Raven's rough skin. Her left shoulder throbbed where she had hit the water awkwardly, but she had escaped relatively unscathed, physically at least. The psychological impact was another matter. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Raven's dark eye regarding her with that unsettling intelligence. She felt again the powerful body rising beneath her, lifting her partially out of the water with effortless strength. Had he intended to pull her under? Or had the contact been investigative rather than predatory? The lines between curiosity and hunting behavior were often blurry in apex predators. The distant sound of engines broke through her thoughts. A Coast Guard vessel was approaching rapidly from the direction of Friday Harbor, its emergency lights flashing. A smaller response boat followed close behind. As the rescue vessels approached, the circling orcas finally began to disperse. One by one, they disappeared beneath the surface, heading west toward open water. Raven was the last to leave, his tall dorsal fin visible long after the others had vanished, until he too slipped beneath the waves and was gone. The Coast Guard. Crew worked with practiced efficiency, transferring the shaken tourists and research team aboard their vessel. Emma found herself wrapped in a fresh thermal blanket, a cup of hot tea pressed into her trembling hands as a medic examined the scrape on her leg. "You're very lucky," the medic commented as he applied antiseptic to the wound. "This is superficial. Given what I heard over the radio about what happened, it could have been much worse." Emma nodded numbly. Lucky wasn't the word she would have chosen. As a scientist, she didn't believe in luck. She believed in data, patterns, and explanations. But nothing in her extensive knowledge of orca behavior could explain what they had just experienced. As the Coast Guard vessel headed back to Friday Harbor, Emma stood at the railing, watching the waves where the Salish explorer had disappeared beneath the surface. The research vessel had been her workplace, her laboratory, and in many ways her home for the past 3 years. Its loss was both personal and professional. Lily joined her at the railing, her usual energetic demeanor subdued. "The data server was in a waterproof case," she said quietly. "We might be able to recover it if they salvage the boat." Emma nodded, grateful for the practical concern that momentarily displaced her darker thoughts. "And the drone?" "Lost," Lily sighed. But the footage was streaming to the cloud until the moment the platform collapsed. "We should have most of the encounter documented." The encounter, such a neutral scientific term for what had felt like a coordinated assault by intelligent predators. Emma wondered how she would describe it in her research notes, how she would frame it for the inevitable investigation that would follow. "No one's going to believe it," Lily said, echoing her thoughts. "Not the way it really happened. They'll say we got too close, or that the boat damaged itself on rocks, or that we're anthropomorphizing normal predatory behavior." Emma gazed out at the now peaceful waters of the Salish Sea, the late afternoon sun turning them golden. "Then we'll let the data speak for itself," she said firmly. We'll analyze the footage, the acoustics, the damages. Science is about evidence, not comfortable assumptions. But as they approached the harbor, with its bustling normalcy of fishing, boats and tourist vessels, Emma couldn't shake the memory of Raven's eye watching her, assessing her, or the deliberate way he had lifted her from the water in those final, terrifying moments before she was pulled to safety. Whatever had happened today went beyond the current scientific understanding of orca behavior, and as both a researcher and a survivor, Emma knew she would not rest until she understood why. The Friday Harbor Marina was ablaze with activity as the Coast Guard vessel docked. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the small island community, and a crowd had gathered. Concerned colleagues from the research center, local authorities, and curious onlookers drawn by the drama unfolding in their normally peaceful harbor. Emma winced as she stepped onto the dock, the adrenaline that had sustained her now fading, allowing pain from her various injuries to surface. Beyond the scrape on her leg and her bruised shoulder, every muscle in her body ached from the violent encounter and the desperate swim. Dr. James Chen, the senior researcher at the San Juan Marine Research Center and Emma's mentor, pushed through the crowd to reach her. In his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, James had the weathered look of someone who had spent decades on the water. "My God, Emma," he said, his normally composed face creased with worry. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "The tourists? Are they all accounted for?" James nodded. "Everyone's safe. Some minor injuries, all being treated. The shock is the worst of it for most," he guided her, gently toward a waiting medical team. "You need to get checked out properly." Emma wanted to protest that she was fine, that there were more pressing matters, data to secure, reports to file, scientific observations to record while they were still fresh in her mind. But her legs seemed to make the decision for her, suddenly wobbly as delayed shock set in. She allowed herself to be led to a waiting ambulance, where paramedics immediately began a more thorough assessment of her condition. BP's elevated, pulse rapid, one of them reported. Mild hypothermia, various contusions, laceration to the right leg. Emma listened to them categorize her injuries with a strange detachment, as if they were discussing someone else. Her mind was still on the water, still processing the sequence of events that had led to this moment. "We should take her to the hospital for observation," the paramedic continued. "Possible concussion, risk of secondary drowning." "No," Emma interrupted firmly. "No hospital. I need to debrief with my team while everything is still fresh." The paramedic frowned. "Dr. Larson, you've experienced a traumatic event and physical injuries. Medical protocol suggests—" "I understand the protocol," Emma cut in. "I'm refusing transport. I'll sign whatever waiver you need." After further discussion and a signed release form, Emma was allowed to leave with James, who promised to personally monitor her condition. The paramedics provided her with dry clothes, wound care supplies, and strict instructions to seek immediate medical attention if certain symptoms developed. As they walked slowly toward the research center's main building, a converted warehouse, at the edge of the marina, Emma became aware of the whispers and stares following them. News traveled fast in a small community like Friday Harbor, and by now everyone had heard some version of what had happened. "They're saying it was a deliberate attack," James said quietly as they walked. "That the orcas targeted your vessel specifically." Emma sighed. "It's more complicated than that. We need to be careful about the narrative that develops. These are wild animals, not monsters." James studied her face. "But something unusual happened out there, something beyond normal orca behavior." "Yes," Emma admitted. "Something I can't explain within our current understanding of transient orca behavior, but that doesn't mean we should jump to sensationalist conclusions." The research center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Lily had preceded them and was already downloading the cloud-backed footage from the drone to the main server. Captain Mike was on the phone with the insurance company, his weathered face grim as he described the damage to the Salish explorer. Several other researchers were monitoring social media, where news of the incident was spreading rapidly, often with wild inaccuracies. "We need to get ahead of this," James declared, taking charge of the situation. "Emma, I know you're exhausted, but can you give us a preliminary account of what happened? Just the facts as you observed them." Emma nodded and allowed herself to be led to the center's conference room. Several colleagues joined them, along with a representative from the local Marine Patrol who would need information for their official report. Someone pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands, and Emma gratefully wrapped her fingers around the warmth. "Start at the beginning," James prompted gently. "What was the first indication that this pod was behaving unusually?" Emma closed her eyes briefly, organizing her thoughts. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, professional, the voice of Dr. Emma Larson, marine biologist, rather than Emma Larson, survivor. "We encountered the T-pod, 5 individuals including T-37A, known as Raven, at approximately 13 to 20 hours near Harrow Strait. Initial observation showed normal hunting behavior as they pursued a stellar sea lion. After a successful hunt, they exhibited typical post-feeding socialization until approximately 14:10 hours, when Raven displayed focused attention on our vessel." She continued methodically through the sequence of events: the pod's approach, their coordinated movements around the vessel, the initial impacts and the escalating damage. She described the deployment of the acoustic deterrent device and the subsequent targeted attack on the research platform where she had been standing. "The collapse of the platform resulted in my entry into the water," she stated, her clinical tone belying the terror of that moment. "I attempted to swim back to the vessel and was intercepted by T-37A, who made physical contact, lifting me partially out of the water before I was pulled aboard by Captain Brennan and Mr. Henderson." The room was silent when she finished her account. Emma took a long sip of tea, aware of the weight of what she had just described. It sounded impossible, fantastical, yet it had happened exactly as she reported. "The behavior you're describing," said Dr. Mira Santos, the center's expert on predatory behavior, "it's more like what we see in great white sharks testing unfamiliar objects, the bump and bite technique, than anything previously documented in orcas. Except they didn't bite," Emma pointed out. "They had multiple opportunities to inflict serious damage to both the vessel and to me personally when I was in the water, but the contacts were measured, controlled." "Investigative rather than predatory," suggested James. Emma shook her head slightly. "I'm not sure those categories apply here. This felt deliberate, coordinated, like they were executing a plan rather than responding instinctively." She was aware of how that sounded, like anthropomorphism, the cardinal sin in scientific observation of animal behavior. Yet the facts as she had experienced them resisted more conventional explanations. "The drone footage should help clarify what happened," Lily interjected from the doorway. "It's ready for review whenever you are." James nodded. "Let's take a break first. Emma needs rest, and we all need time to process what we've heard." As the meeting broke up, Emma found herself approached by Daniel Henderson, the high school biology teacher who had helped pull her from the water. His clothes were still damp, and he looked as shaken as she felt. "Dr. Larson," he said quietly, "I just wanted to check that you're okay. That was..." He trailed off, seemingly unable to find adequate words. "Thank you for your help out there," Emma replied sincerely. "If you and Mike hadn't pulled me up when..." "You did..." She left the sentence unfinished, not wanting to consider the alternative. Daniel nodded, understanding the unspoken. "I've been teaching marine biology for 11 years. Everything I teach my students about orca behavior. None of it explains what we saw today." "No," Emma agreed. "It doesn't." "When that big male lifted you up from below," Daniel continued, his voice lowered, "it wasn't like he was trying to pull you under. It was almost like he was presenting you to us, like he wanted us to take you back." Emma felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with her still damp clothes or mild hypothermia. She had been so focused on her own survival in that moment that she hadn't considered the peculiarity of Raven's action. If he had wanted to pull her under, his strength would have made it effortless. Instead, he had lifted her toward the hands reaching down from the boat. "I need to review the footage," she said, suddenly urgent. "There might be details we missed in the moment." James, overhearing, stepped in. "Rest first, the footage will still be there in a few hours." Emma wanted to protest but found she lacked the energy. The events of the day were catching up with her, and a bone-deep exhaustion was setting in. She allowed James to drive her to her small waterfront apartment, extracting a promise that he would return in 3 hours to take her back to the center. Alone in her apartment, Emma stood under a hot shower for long minutes, letting the warmth penetrate her chilled body. As the water cascaded over her, images from the day flashed through her mind. The sea lion's desperate attempt to escape, Raven's eye regarding her from just feet away, the terrifying moment when the platform collapsed beneath her. She examined the scrape on her leg more carefully. It was about 8 inches long, running from just below her knee down her calf, a surface wound that was already beginning to scab over. Had it come from contact with the collapsing platform, or from Raven's rough skin when he lifted her? The Tiwa. Latter possibility sent another shiver through her despite the hot water. She had been touched by one of the ocean's most powerful predators and had somehow survived to contemplate the experience. After the shower, Emma changed into dry, comfortable clothes and made herself a sandwich, though she had little appetite. She knew she should try to sleep, but her mind was too active, processing and reprocessing the events of the day. Instead, she went to her home office and opened her laptop. The scientific literature on orca behavior was extensive, and much of it was stored in her personal database. She began searching for any documented cases of orcas showing similar behavior toward vessels or humans. There were plenty of anecdotal reports, sailors' tales of orcas approaching or even bumping their boats, particularly in the Strait of Gibraltar, where several incidents had been reported in recent years, but nothing that matched the organized, persistent nature of what she had witnessed today. She expanded her search to include other cetaceans and found more relevant data. There were documented cases of dolphins protecting humans from sharks, of humpback whales interfering with, orca hunts to protect other species, of various cetaceans displaying what appeared to be altruistic behavior across species boundaries. But she also found the darker cases, sperm whales ramming whaling vessels in the 19th century, seemingly in retaliation for being hunted, dolphins occasionally displaying aggressive behavior toward humans during close encounters, and the troubling incidents involving captive orcas, particularly the deaths associated with Tilikum at SeaWorld. None of it provided a satisfying framework for understanding what had happened today. Wild orcas simply did not attack boats in the coordinated, persistent manner Emma had witnessed, and they certainly didn't single out specific humans for close investigation. Her eyelids grew heavy as she read, and eventually she dozed off at her desk, the laptop still open before her. Her sleep was restless, filled with dreams of dark water and powerful bodies moving just at the edge of visibility. She woke with a start at the sound of a knock at her door. James had returned as promised, looking concerned when he saw her disheveled state. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little," Emma admitted, running a hand through her tangled hair. "I was researching similar incidents." "And?" "Nothing that matches what we experienced." "Not even close." She grabbed her jacket. "Let's go review that footage." Back at the research center, they found several colleagues still working, analyzing data and monitoring the public response to the incident. News had spread nationally now, with major networks picking up the story of the orca attack near San Juan Island. "We're getting calls from every media outlet imaginable," reported Denise Chang, the center's communications director. "Everyone wants an interview with the woman who survived an orca attack." Emma grimaced. "We need to be extremely careful about the messaging here. These are already being described as killer whales in the worst sense, and that kind of fear-mongering could set back conservation efforts significantly." "Agreed," said James, "but we also need to be truthful about what happened. Finding that balance won't be easy." They moved to the analysis lab, where Lily had prepared the drone footage for review. The high-definition video from above provided a perspective Emma hadn't had during the encounter, a bird's-eye view of the coordinated movements of the orca pod around the vessel. Play it from the beginning of the unusual behavior, Emma requested, settling into a chair next to Lily. The footage began with Raven spy-hopping near the vessel, his massive head partially out of the water as he observed the boat. The change in the pod's movement that followed was striking, from random post-feeding socializing to a directed approach with all 5 orcas suddenly moving with clear purpose. "Look at the formation," Lily pointed out. "It's identical to the pattern they used when herding the sea lion earlier." She was right. The orcas had formed a crescent shape behind the vessel, gradually closing the distance even as the boat began to move away. "Speed up to the first impact," Emma requested. The footage advanced to show Raven diving deep beneath the vessel before surging upward to strike it from below. The precision of the impact was notable. He hit at what appeared to be a specific structural point, rather than randomly ramming the hull. "He's targeting the keel joint," observed Mike, who had joined them for the review. "That's one of the most vulnerable points on that vessel design. If you wanted to cause flooding without immediately sinking the boat, that's exactly where you'd hit it." The implication hung heavy in the air. Could an orca, even one as intelligent as these animals were known to be, understand the structural vulnerabilities of a human vessel? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence before them suggested precisely that. They continued through the footage, watching as the pod adjusted their tactics in response to the vessel's movements, consistently anticipating escape routes and blocking them. "It's like watching a coordinated military operation," murmured James. "Look at how they communicate. Minimal vocalization but perfect synchronization." When they reached the deployment of the acoustic deterrent, Emma leaned forward, particularly interested in seeing what had happened from above. The footage showed her on the research platform, lowering the device into the water. The orcas initially moved away just as she had observed. Then came the moment when Raven broke from the pattern. The massive orca swam directly toward the platform, accelerating just before he reached it. The breach was spectacular, his entire body clearing the water less than 10 feet from where Emma stood. "Freeze that," Emma requested. The image paused with Raven suspended in air, water streaming from his massive body. From this angle it was clear that the breach was precisely calculated, close enough to intimidate but not to make contact. "That's a warning," said Mira. "He's telling you to stop using the deterrent." "Play on," Emma said quietly. The footage continued, showing Raven's approach alongside the platform, his eye level with Emma's position. This moment, which had seemed to stretch for an eternity during the actual encounter, lasted only seconds on the video. Then came the attack on the platform itself. From above, they could see Raven dive deep, circle once beneath the boat, and then surge upward with tremendous power directly beneath the platform. The metal supports buckled instantly under the impact, collapsing the structure and plunging Emma into the water. What followed was difficult to watch, even knowing the outcome. The drone footage showed Emma surfacing and swimming desperately toward the vessel. It captured Raven's approach from below, his massive body clearly visible as a dark shadow moving through the blue water. The moment of contact was partially obscured by the spray and churning water, but the footage clearly showed what happened. Next, Raven positioning himself beneath Emma and lifting her upward, toward the hands reaching down from the boat rather than pulling her under. "Play that part again," Emma requested, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily rewound the footage and played the sequence again in slow motion. There was no mistaking what they were seeing. The orca's movement wasn't aggressive, it was almost desistive. "He's helping them pull you out," Lily said, echoing Emma's thoughts. The revelation silenced the room. If accurate, it completely changed the interpretation of what had happened. Not a predatory attack, but something far more complex. A demonstration, perhaps, or a form of communication they weren't equipped to understand. "We need to be extremely cautious about this interpretation," James finally said. "The anthropomorphic implications would be extraordinarily controversial." Emma nodded slowly. "I agree. We need more data before we can draw any definitive conclusions. But what we're seeing here doesn't align with any recognized predatory behavior." They continued reviewing the footage, watching as the pod circled the sinking vessel and life raft, maintaining distance but not departing, until the Coast Guard vessels appeared. Even then, Raven was the last to leave, his distinctive dorsal fin visible, long after the others had departed. "It's like he wanted to make sure you were safe," Lily observed quietly. "That the rescue was successful." Emma didn't respond directly to this suggestion. The implications were too enormous, too challenging to existing understanding of Orca cognition and motivation. Instead, she focused on the empirical questions raised by the footage. "We need to analyze the acoustic data from the hydrophones," she said. "There might be vocalizations we didn't detect during the encounter that could help explain the coordination we're seeing." The team agreed to continue the analysis through the night, processing the various data streams they had collected during the encounter. Emma, despite her exhaustion, insisted on staying. "You need rest," James argued. "You've experienced physical trauma and shock. This can wait until tomorrow." "I can't rest," Emma replied honestly. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water looking into his eye. I need to understand what happened today, James. Not just for science, but for my own peace of mind." Recognizing the determination in her voice, James relented. "2 more hours. Then I'm driving you home and you're taking a sleeping pill if necessary." The next 2 hours passed in focused work as they processed and analyzed the data. The hydrophone recordings yielded interesting results, a series of low-frequency pulses just before each coordinated movement by the pod, suggesting a form of communication beyond the typical Orca vocalizations. "It's almost like a tactical language," observed Lily as they listened to the slowed-down recordings, specific signals for specific maneuvers. By the time James insisted that Emma leave, they had established a preliminary timeline of the incident and identified key questions for further investigation. But they were still far from understanding the underlying reasons for the Orca's behavior. As promised, James drove Emma home, extracting a promise that she would take the day off tomorrow to recover. "The data will still be there," he reminded her, "and you'll think more clearly after proper rest." Alone again in her apartment, Emma found herself drawn to the window overlooking the harbor. The water was calm under the moonlight, giving no hint of the drama that had unfolded on its surface hours earlier. Somewhere out there, Raven and his pod were continuing their lives, hunting, socializing, navigating their marine world with the complex intelligence that had evolved over millions of years. Had today's encounter been simply a territorial display that escalated unexpectedly, a response to some perceived threat, or something more deliberate, a demonstration of power perhaps, or even an attempt at interspecies communication in the only language available to them? Emma pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The scientific questions were fascinating, challenging, potentially revolutionary for the field of marine mammal cognition. But beneath the professional curiosity lay a more personal question that she couldn't escape. Why her? Why had Raven singled her out? And when he had her in the water, vulnerable and at his mercy, why had he chosen to lift her towards safety rather than pull her into the depths? Sleep, when it finally came, brought no answers. Only dreams of dark water and watchful eyes. Emma woke to the persistent vibration of her phone on the bedside table. The screen showed multiple missed calls and a flood of messages. Colleagues, journalists, friends and family who had heard about the incident on the news. She ignored them all for the moment, focusing instead on assessing her physical condition. The dull throb in her shoulder had intensified overnight, and the scrape on her leg stung when she swung her feet to the floor. Various other bruises and strains made themselves known as she carefully stood and stretched. Nothing serious, but enough to remind her body of yesterday's trauma. Her mind, however, felt clearer after nearly 9 hours of sleep. The shock had receded somewhat, allowing her analytical thoughts to gain precedence over the emotional response to the encounter. She needed to approach this methodically, scientifically, to understand what had happened, not just as a survivor but as a researcher. After a quick breakfast and stronger coffee than usual, Emma checked her messages, responding only to James to confirm she was following orders and taking the day to recover. Then she returned to her home office and opened her laptop. The incident would already be generating significant discussion in the scientific community. Emma navigated to several forums and journals where marine biologists shared observations and data. Sure enough, threads had already appeared discussing the San Juan Orca incident, as it was being called. The responses ranged from skepticism to speculation. Some researchers suggested the encounter had likely been exaggerated in the retelling, that the orcas had probably been investigating the boat out of curiosity and inadvertently caused damage. Others proposed more concerning explanations, that changes in the marine ecosystem might be altering orca behavior in unexpected ways, or that increased human activity in orca habitats was creating new conflicts. What troubled Emma most was the emergence of sensationalist coverage. Several news outlets were already running stories with headlines like "Killer whales live up to their name" and "Orca attack survivor recounts harrowing escape." These narratives not only misrepresented what had happened, but could potentially harm conservation efforts and public perception of these animals. She was contemplating whether to make a public statement when her phone rang. The caller ID showed NOAA Fisheries, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Division responsible for marine mammal protection and research. "Dr. Larson speaking," she answered, her professional tone masking her surprise. "Dr. Larson, this is Richard Torres with NOAA Fisheries." The voice was deep, authoritative. "I'm calling regarding the incident yesterday involving transient orcas near San Juan Island." "Yes, of course," Emma replied, sitting up straighter. NOAA's involvement suggested the incident was being taken seriously at the federal level. "We're convening an emergency assessment team to investigate this encounter," Torres continued. "Given your direct involvement and expertise, we'd like you to participate in the investigation." Emma hesitated only briefly. "I'd be happy to contribute, Dr. Torres, though I should note that as a primary witness, there may be concerns about objectivity." "We're aware of that potential conflict," Torres acknowledged, "but your expertise in transient orca behavior is too valuable to exclude, particularly since you observed the entire encounter firsthand. We'll have other researchers involved to provide balance." They discussed the logistics briefly. A preliminary meeting was scheduled for the following morning at the NOAA research station on the other side of the island. Emma would be expected to provide a comprehensive report of her observations, along with any relevant data collected during the encounter. After ending the call, Emma sat quietly for a moment processing this development. NOAA's involvement elevated the incident from a local curiosity to a matter of scientific and regulatory significance. It also meant that every aspect of the encounter would be scrutinized, analyzed, and eventually documented in official reports. She needed to be prepared, not just with her observations, but with a reasoned scientific assessment of what had occurred. Setting aside the visceral, emotional experience of being in the water with Raven, what did the empirical evidence suggest about the orca's behavior? Emma opened a new document and began typing, organizing her thoughts systematically. Observed behaviors. PART. Initial curiosity assessment. Spy hopping, close approach. Coordinated encirclement of vessel. Targeted impacts to specific structural points. Responsive tactics, adjusting to vessel's movements. Focused attention on acoustic deterrent and its operator. 6. Direct intervention with human in water, lift rather than attack. Continued observation until rescue arrived. Potential interpretations. GAS. Territorial defense. GAS 2. Resource protection. PES. Investigation of novel stimulus. CASH. Response to perceived threat. 5. Demonstration of capacity. Display behavior. PIX. Complex communication attempt. Contextual factors. P1. Previous unusual behaviors from this specific body. Seat 2. Changes in prey distribution in the region. 2. Increased vessel traffic in core habitat areas. Sure. Possible previous negative interactions with vessels, humans. The list was a starting point, a framework for analyzing what had happened without leaping to conclusions, either fearful ones about killer whales or overly anthropomorphic ones about orcas with human-like motivations. The truth, Emma suspected, was more complex than either extreme. She was deep in research when a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Mike Brennan, the captain of the now sunken Salish explorer. She opened the door, surprised by his visit. "Mike, I didn't expect to see you today." The captain looked tired, the lines in his weathered face deeper than usual. "Thought I'd check on you. Mind if I come in?" Emma welcomed him into her small living room. Mike declined her offer of coffee, instead sitting heavily on her couch, his large hands clasped between his knees. "How are you holding up?" he asked, studying her face. "I'm okay," Emma replied automatically, then amended, "physically at least, still processing everything mentally. You?" Mike shook his head slowly. 32 years on the water, never seen anything like it." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Insurance adjuster's been by already. They're treating it as an act of nature, which means they'll cover most of the loss." "That's good news," Emma offered. "Is it?" Mike looked up at her, his blue eyes troubled. "An act of nature suggests what happened was just wild animals being wild animals. Random, unpredictable." He leaned forward slightly. "But that's not what we saw out there, is it?" Emma hesitated. "What do you think we saw, Mike?" "Something deliberate." His voice was low, serious. "When that big male hit the boat, Raven you call him, he knew exactly where to hit for maximum damage with minimum effort, like he'd studied vessel design." Mike shook his head again. "I know how that sounds. But I've been on the water my whole life, Emma. I know the difference between an animal acting on instinct and whatever that was." His assessment aligned with Emma's own analysis, but hearing it from Mike, a practical, experienced seaman rather than a scientist, gave it a different weight. "Noah's forming an investigative team," she told him. "I'll be participating. Your observations would be valuable if you're willing to share them." Mike nodded slowly. "I'll tell them what I saw, but between us." He hesitated, then continued, "I'm not sure I want to go back out there. Not right away, at least. First time in my life I felt that way about the water." The admission clearly cost him, and Emma felt a surge of empathy. Mike's entire identity was bound up in his life on the sea. For him to express reluctance about returning to it spoke volumes about the psychological impact of the encounter. "I understand," she said simply. "I'm still figuring out how I feel about it myself." They talked a while longer about practical matters, the salvage operation for the Salish explorer, the statements they'd need to provide for insurance, and regulatory purposes, the media requests that were pouring in. When Mike finally left, promising to attend the Noe meeting the next day, Emma returned to her research with a renewed sense of purpose. If the encounter had affected a veteran seaman like Mike so profoundly, how was it being interpreted by others with less experience or scientific background? The potential for misunderstanding and fearful reactions was significant. Getting the facts right and presenting them in a way that was both accurate and responsible was more important than ever. Emma spent the afternoon reviewing scientific literature on complex cetacean behavior, particularly focusing on cases that defied simple explanations. She found numerous examples of dolphins and whales exhibiting behaviors that suggested sophisticated problem-solving, tool use, cultural learning, and even what some researchers cautiously termed moral behaviors, such as helping injured members of their own species or even other species entirely. But she found nothing that matched what she had witnessed. A coordinated action against a vessel that showed evidence of tactical planning, followed by a direct but non-predatory interaction with a human. It was unprecedented, at least in the published literature. As evening approached, Emma forced herself to take a break. Her shoulder was aching from hours at the computer, and her mind needed time to process everything she'd reviewed. She made a simple dinner and took it out to her small balcony overlooking the harbor. The sun was setting over the islands, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, a few boats were returning to the harbor after a day on the water, their running lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. Emma's phone chimed with a text from Lily. "News update you should see. Teapot spotted again near Lime Kiln. Same behavior reported with another tour boat." Her heart rate immediately accelerated. Emma set down her plate and called Lily directly. "What happened?" she demanded as soon as Lily answered. "Was anyone hurt?" "No injuries," Lily assured her quickly, but the behavior was similar. Direct approach, circling, apparent assessment. The boat captain recognized Raven's distinctive fin and got out of there immediately. Made it back to harbor safely. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So no physical contact with the vessel?" "None," Lily confirmed. "But, Emma..." They followed the boat all the way back to the coastal waters near the harbor. Only turned away when they encountered other vessels. It's like they were making sure it left their territory. The implications were simultaneously relieving and concerning. No one had been hurt, but the behavior suggested the previous day's encounter hadn't been an isolated incident. Something had changed in the Orca's relationship with vessels in their territory. "Has NOAA been notified?" Emma asked. "They're aware," Lily confirmed. "It's going to be a topic at tomorrow's meeting. James wanted me to let you know in advance so you could think about it." After ending the call, Emma returned to her balcony, but the peaceful scene no longer brought comfort. Somewhere out in those waters, Raven and his pod were continuing their activities, perhaps still exhibiting this new, troubling behavior toward human vessels. Understanding why had just become even more urgent. The next morning, Emma drove her small Subaru across San Juan Island to the NOAA research station. The facility was newer and better equipped than the non-profit center where she worked, with expansive views of the water and state-of-the-art laboratories. Under different circumstances, she would have enjoyed the opportunity to collaborate with the federal researchers. Today, however, the purpose lent a gravity to her arrival. James was waiting for her in the parking lot. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes taking in the dark circles under hers. "I'm fine," Emma replied automatically. Seeing his skeptical expression, she amended, "Better, still processing." James nodded and walked with her toward the main building. There's considerable interest in this meeting. Beyond the scientific implications, there are regulatory considerations. If transient orcas are exhibiting aggressive behavior toward vessels, it could impact everything from tour operations to shipping routes. Inside the conference room, Emma found a larger group than she had expected. Besides the NOAA scientists and her own colleagues, representatives from the Coast Guard, Washington State Fish and Wildlife, and the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans were present. The international presence underscored the significance of the incident. Orcas regularly crossed the border between US and Canadian waters, making their management a binational concern. Dr. Richard Torres called the meeting to order. In person, he was an imposing figure, tall with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "As you know, we're here to assess an unusual and concerning series of interactions between transient orcas and vessels in the Salish Sea." Emma noted his use of series rather than incident, acknowledging that what had happened to the Salish explorer wasn't isolated. Torres continued, "Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to acknowledge Dr. Emma Larson, who experienced the most direct encounter with these orcas. Dr. Larson, on behalf of NOAA, I want to express our relief that you and everyone aboard your vessel survived what must have been a terrifying experience." Emma nodded her thanks, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but recognizing the necessity of her testimony. The meeting proceeded with clinical efficiency. Each participant with relevant information or expertise presented their observations and analysis. The Coast Guard representative detailed their response and the condition of the vessel when they arrived. Mike described the structural damage to the Salish explorer and his observations of the orca's movements. Lily presented the drone footage, which many of the attendees were seeing for the first time. When Emma's turn came, she delivered her account with scientific precision, avoiding emotional language or speculation. She described the sequence of events exactly as she had observed them, including the final moments when Raven had lifted her in the water. "To be clear," interrupted Dr. Abigail Chen, a NOAA cetacean specialist, "you believe the orca was assisting your rescue rather than attempting to submerge you." Emma chose her words carefully. I can only report what I observed. The Orca positioned itself beneath me and lifted upward, toward the hands reaching down from the vessel. Whether that constitutes assistance or was part of some other behavior, I can't definitively state. But it was not consistent with predatory behavior as we understand it. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. And in your professional assessment, these behaviors indicate what exactly? The behaviors indicate a level of coordination, strategic thinking, and responsiveness that goes beyond what we typically document in transient Orca pods, Emma replied. The targeting of specific structural elements of the vessel, the coordinated movements in response to our evasive actions, and the focused attention on the acoustic deterrent device all suggest complex problem-solving rather than instinctive responses. The discussion that followed was wide-ranging and occasionally heated. Some researchers suggested the behaviors could be explained within existing frameworks of territorial defense or novel object investigation. Others argued that the coordination and apparent intentionality pointed to cognitive abilities that science had underestimated. The representative from the Tour Boat Operators Association raised practical concerns about safety and the potential economic impact if the waters around San Juan Island were deemed unsafe for whale watching. We need to consider immediate protective measures, he argued. If these orcas are targeting vessels, we need to establish guidelines or restrictions until we understand what's happening. Dr. Torres nodded. That brings us to the question of management response. While we gather more data, what interim measures should we implement? The resulting debate centered on balancing safety concerns with research needs and economic interests. Emma listened carefully, aware that the decisions made in this room would affect not only human activities, but potentially the orcas themselves. When asked for her recommendation, she didn't hesitate. I believe we need a temporary restriction on vessels in the areas where this pod has been active. Not a complete exclusion, but a significant reduction in traffic and strict enforcement of distance regulations. Simultaneously, we need dedicated research vessels with experienced observers to document any further encounters safely. And if there are further aggressive interactions, pressed Torres, then we re-evaluate, Emma replied firmly. But I want to emphasize that these animals are showing extraordinary behavioral adaptation, not mindless aggression. Our response should reflect that understanding. By the end of the marathon 6-hour meeting, a preliminary action plan had been developed. NOAA would issue an advisory for the affected waters, recommending that recreational vessels avoid the area entirely and that commercial operations maintain greater than normal distances from any observed orcas. 2 research vessels with experienced observers would be deployed to monitor the T-pod's movements and behaviors. A dedicated hotline would be established for reporting any unusual orca encounters. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Torres approached Emma privately. Dr. Larson, NOAA would like to engage you as a special consultant on this investigation. Your expertise with this specific pod and your first-hand experience of their behavior makes you uniquely qualified. The offer was both flattering and somewhat intimidating. Emma had collaborated with NOAA on various projects throughout her career, but never in such a high-profile context. I'd be happy to assist, she replied, though I should note that my primary commitment is to the San Juan Marine Research Center. Torres nodded. We understand. This would be a part-time consultation, primarily involving analysis of data and participation in assessment meetings. We'd compensate your time, of course. They worked out the details, and Emma left the meeting with mixed emotions. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the circumstances that had led to it were troubling. As a scientist, she was fascinated by the complex behavior the orcas were exhibiting. As someone who had been in the water with Raven, feeling his massive body lift her toward the surface, she couldn't help but feel a more personal connection to the outcome of the investigation. James caught up with her in the parking lot. Quite a meeting, he commented. How are you feeling about the NOAA appointment? It makes sense, Emma replied, leaning against her car. I just hope I can maintain scientific objectivity given my personal involvement. James studied her face. That's exactly why you're the right person for this. You won't sensationalize or oversimplify what happened because you experienced it directly." He paused, then added, "But don't neglect the psychological impact, Emma. What you went through was traumatic, regardless of the scientific significance." She nodded, acknowledging his concern without fully accepting it. "I'm managing. Being involved in the investigation helps, actually. Gives me a framework for processing what happened." That evening, after returning to her apartment, Emma received a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Junko Nakamura, a Japanese researcher known for her groundbreaking work on cetacean cognition. Emma had met her at several international conferences, but hadn't spoken with her directly in over a year. "I hope you don't mind the call," Dr. Nakamura began. "I heard about your encounter through our professional network and wanted to reach out personally." "Not at all," Emma replied, surprised and pleased. "It's good to hear from you." "I've been reviewing the available information about your experience," Dr. Nakamura continued. "It reminds me of something we've been documenting with a pod of false killer whales near Okinawa. Complex, apparently deliberate interactions with human vessels that don't fit established behavioral patterns." Emma sat up straighter, immediately interested. "You've observed similar behaviors. What were the circumstances?" "Different in detail but similar in complexity," Dr. Nakamura explained. "A pod of false killer whales began approaching fishing vessels in a specific pattern, circling, diving beneath them, occasionally making physical contact. Initially, it was interpreted as aggressive or territorial behavior." "And it wasn't," Emma prompted when the other scientist paused. "We now believe they were attempting to lead the vessels to an area where illegal drift nets had been abandoned. When the fishermen finally followed the whales, they discovered nets that were entangling other marine life. After the nets were removed, the behavior ceased." Emma processed this information. "You're suggesting the behavior was communicative? An attempt to solicit human assistance?" "That's our current working hypothesis, Dr. Nakamura confirmed. It's controversial, of course. Many colleagues believe we're anthropomorphizing or seeing patterns where there are only coincidences. But the temporal and spatial correlations are difficult to dismiss." They discussed the similarities and differences between the two cases for nearly an hour. While Dr. Nakamura was careful not to jump to conclusions about Emma's experience, her research offered a potential framework for understanding what had happened, one that didn't rely on either fear-based interpretations of killer whales or naive anthropomorphism. "I'd be interested in collaborating on this investigation," Dr. Nakamura offered as they concluded the call. "If you're collecting additional data, perhaps we could analyze it jointly, comparing it with our Okinawa observations." Emma eagerly accepted the offer. International scientific collaboration would strengthen whatever conclusions they eventually reached, whether they supported Dr. Nakamura's hypothesis or pointed in another direction entirely. After the call, Emma stood at her window again, looking out at the darkened harbor. The conversation had opened new possibilities in her thinking about the encounter. What if Raven and his pod hadn't been displaying aggression or territorial defense, but attempting something else entirely? What if the apparent attack on the vessel had been an extreme form of attention-getting, a desperate attempt to communicate something humans weren't understanding through more subtle means? The hypothesis was speculative, certainly, but no more so than assuming. The Orcas had suddenly developed anti-human aggression after millennia of general disinterest in humans as either prey or enemies. Emma's phone chimed with a text from Lily. "Drone footage from today's research vessel tracking T-Pod just came in. Nothing unusual in their behavior, normal hunting and socializing, no approaches to the vessel at all." This was simultaneously reassuring and perplexing. If the Orcas had been protecting territory or resources, they should have shown similar responses to the research vessel as they had to the tour boats. The inconsistency suggested more complex factors at work. Emma replied, "Any visual of Raven specifically?" Lily's response came quickly. "Yes, present with pod, participating in hunt. No unusual behavior noted." Emma set down her phone, thinking. Tomorrow she would begin her official role as NOAA consultant, reviewing all available data on the T-Pod's historical behaviors and movements. Perhaps patterns would emerge that would help explain what had happened and predict whether it would happen again. For now, though, she needed rest. The physical and emotional demands of the past 2 days had taken their toll. As she prepared for bed, Emma found herself unconsciously touching the healing scrape on her leg, the physical reminder of her encounter with Raven. In her dreams that night, she was underwater again, but not in fear. She moved through the blue depths with purpose, following a massive black and white form that glided effortlessly ahead of her. Raven turned occasionally, as if checking that she was still following, leading her towards something she couldn't yet see but somehow knew was important. She woke before discovering what it was, the phantom sensation of water pressure still surrounding her. The feeling lingered as she showered and dressed, a sense of unfinished business, of a conversation interrupted. Emma recognized the psychological mechanism at work. Her mind was trying to create meaning and resolution from a traumatic experience. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to understand about what had happened between her and Raven in those moments when they had looked into each other's eyes. Science would provide answers, she reminded herself, as she prepared for her first day as a NOAA consultant. Systematic observation, data analysis, hypothesis testing, these were the tools that would eventually make sense of the encounter. It was the process she had dedicated her life to, and she trusted it implicitly. Yet as she drove toward the research station, Emma wondered if science as currently practiced had the right framework to fully comprehend what had happened. Perhaps understanding Raven would require not just rigorous methodology, but a fundamental shift in how humans conceptualized non-human intelligence, an openness to forms of cognition and communication that didn't mirror our own, but were no less sophisticated for their difference. The NOAA research vessel, Soundwatch, cut through the morning mist that hung over the waters of Harrow Strait. Emma stood on the observation deck, her binoculars scanning the horizon for any sign of dorsal fins breaking the surface. Beside her, Dr. Torres adjusted the settings on a specialized camera designed to capture high-definition video, even in challenging light conditions. It had been 3 weeks since the encounter with Raven and his pod. In that time, Emma had fully immersed herself in the investigation, dividing her time between data analysis at the research station and field observations aboard the monitoring vessels. The scrape on her leg had healed to a pink line, and her shoulder rarely bothered her now, except after long days hunched over computers or standing on observation decks. The psychological healing was less straightforward. Emma still experienced occasional flashbacks, sudden vivid recollections of being in the water, feeling Raven's massive body beneath her. She had declined James's suggestion that she speak with a trauma counselor, insisting that her involvement in the investigation was therapeutic in itself. It was partly true. The immersion in scientific work provided some insulation from the emotional impact of the experience. Movement at 2 o'clock, called Alexandra Diaz, one of the NOAA researchers, pointing toward a disturbance in the water approximately half a mile distant. Emma swung her binoculars in that direction, focusing on the spot where ripples suggested something large had just submerged. For several long moments there was nothing. Then a tall dorsal fin sliced through the surface, followed by a second, smaller one. T-Pod confirmed, Emma announced, recognizing the distinctive shape of Raven's fin even at this distance. 2 individuals surfacing, heading northwest. Torres activated the shipboard communication system. All observers to positions. Maintain minimum approach distance of 500 yards. Passive. Acoustics only. No active sonar. The increased distance, more than double the usual regulatory requirement, was part of the management protocol established after the incident. So far, it seemed to be effective. In the 3 weeks of monitoring, the Orcas had shown no unusual interest in the research vessels maintaining these distances. Emma kept her binoculars fixed on the spot where the Orcas had surfaced, knowing they could travel substantial distances underwater before needing to breathe again. Sure enough, they reappeared nearly a quarter mile from their previous position, now joined by 3 more members of the pod. "Full pod in view," she reported. "Normal travel formation." One of the shipboard hydrophones was lowered into the water, and soon the faint sounds of Orca vocalizations filled the monitoring station. The transients were being typically quiet. Their mammal prey could hear their calls, unlike the salmon that resident orcas hunted, so they communicated sparingly and often in frequencies their prey couldn't detect. "They're heading toward Turnpoint," observed Torres. "There's been a group of stellar sea lions reported there this morning." Emma nodded. The behavior was consistent with normal hunting patterns for this pod. Over the past 3 weeks, they had documented several successful hunts, mostly seals and sea lions, though they had also observed the pod taking down a minke whale in a spectacular display of coordinated hunting. Throughout all these observations, the orcas had shown no unusual interest in the research vessels or the few other boats that had ventured into these waters under the strict new management protocols. It was as if the incidents with the tour boats had never happened, a fact that both relieved and perplexed the research team. "It's like they've completely switched off whatever triggered the previous behavior," Emma had commented during a recent assessment meeting. "Or the trigger isn't present," Dr. Nakamura had suggested via video conference. Something specific about the tour vessels or their operation may have elicited the response. This hypothesis had led to a detailed comparison of vessel types, engine sounds, passenger behaviors, and operational patterns between the affected tour boats and the unaffected research vessels. So far, no clear differentiating factor had emerged, but the investigation continued. Now, as the Soundwatch maintained its distance from the hunting orcas, Emma found herself studying Raven's movements with particular intensity. There was nothing in his behavior that would suggest to an objective observer that this was the same animal that had deliberately rammed a vessel and made direct contact with a human just weeks earlier. He moved with the same fluid grace as always, coordinating seamlessly with his pod members as they began to encircle what appeared to be a resting group of sea lions. "They're setting up a hunt," Torres observed, his camera tracking the orca's movements. Classic pincer formation. The research team watched in silence as the predation event unfolded. Despite having witnessed similar hunts many times before, Emma never ceased to be impressed by the intelligence and coordination displayed. The 5 orcas worked with precision that would make military tacticians envious, cutting off escape routes and taking turns pursuing the increasingly desperate sea lions. When the kill finally came, it was swift and efficient. Raven surged beneath one of the larger sea lions, striking it from below with such force that the animal was thrown into the air. Before it could recover, 2 other orcas closed in, dragging it beneath the surface. "Time of kill 10:37, noted one of the researchers, documenting the event with scientific detachment. The successful hunt was followed by the typical social behavior as the orcas shared their meal and engaged in what appeared to be celebratory activities, tail slapping, partial breaches, rolling at the surface. It was during these post-hunt celebrations that Emma had often observed individual personalities, most clearly expressed among orcas. Today was no exception. While most of the pod engaged in relatively calm social behavior, Raven performed a series of spectacular full breaches, his massive body completely clearing the water before crashing back down with tremendous splashes. It was a display of physical power that never failed to impress observers. "He's showing off," murmured Alexandra, who had been working with Emma on the investigation since its inception. Emma smiled slightly, but didn't respond directly. Anthropomorphic. Interpretations were inevitable when observing such intelligent animals, but as scientists, they tried to maintain more neutral descriptions. Still, it was difficult not to see Raven's dramatic displays as expressions of individual character rather than merely instinctive behaviors. After approximately 40 minutes of observation, Torres gave the order to continue their planned survey route, leaving the orcas to their post-hunt activities. As the vessel turned away, Emma kept her binoculars trained on the pod until they disappeared from view around a headland. "Still nothing unusual," Torres commented as they moved into the research vessel's cabin for a debrief. 3 weeks of normal behavior, which itself is significant data, Emma pointed out, accepting the cup of coffee Alexandra handed her. "Whatever triggered the incidents with the tour boats hasn't been present during our observations." Torres nodded thoughtfully. The question is whether that's because of the management changes we've implemented, greater distances, reduced vessel, numbers, stricter approach protocols, or because there was something specific about those tour boats that we haven't identified yet. Or something specific about the days when the incidents occurred, added Alexandra. Environmental factors, prey distribution, previous human interactions we're not aware of. The discussion continued as they reviewed the morning's observations and compared them with the growing database of documented behaviors since the incident. Patterns were emerging, but not necessarily clarifying ones. Later that afternoon, as the Soundwatch returned to port, Emma checked her phone and found a message from James. "Need to talk when you're back. New development." The cryptic nature of the message sent a ripple of concern through her. Had there been another incident? She called him immediately. "Emma," James answered on the first ring. "Good, you got my message. Can you come to the center when you dock? There's someone here you should meet." "Who?" Emma asked, curiosity piqued. "A fisherman named Ray Cordova. He has information about Raven that predates our research center's records. I think you'll want to hear it directly from him." Intrigued, Emma agreed to head straight to the center after docking. She said quick goodbyes to the NOAA team and drove directly from the marina to the San Juan Marine Research Center. James was waiting in the conference room with an elderly man who rose slowly to his feet as Emma entered. Ray Cordova had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades on the water. Deeply tanned skin creased like well-worn leather, hands gnarled from years of working with fishing gear, eyes that had spent a lifetime squinting against sun, reflected off water. "Dr. Larson," he said, his voice gravelly but strong. "Heard you had quite an experience with old Razor." "Razor?" Emma repeated, confused. "That's what we called him back then," Cordova explained, settling back into his chair. "The big male orca with the tilted fin. You folks call him Raven now, I understand." Emma sat down, suddenly intensely interested. "You've known this specific orca for some time?" Cordova nodded. "Going on 15 years. I was fishing these waters when he was just a youngster, still with his mama. Always stood out from the others, bolder, more curious about the boats." "Ray came in this morning after hearing about the investigation on the local news," James explained. "He has some historical perspective that isn't in our research records." "I'm not a scientist," Cordova said, spreading his gnarled hands. "Just an old fisherman with a good memory for the creatures I've shared these waters with. But I thought you might want to hear about another incident with that same orca. Happened about 12 years ago." Emma leaned forward. "Please tell me everything you remember." Cordova settled back in his chair, gathering his thoughts. "It was early October 2013. I was running a small commercial operation back then. Had a 38-foot trawler called the Northern Light. We were fishing for salmon near Boundary Pass." He described how he and his two-man crew had noticed a pod of orcas hunting nearby. They had adjusted their course to maintain distance, respecting the regulations even then. But one of the orcas, a young male with a distinctive fin that Cordova immediately recognized as Raven, had broken from the pod and approached their vessel. At first we thought he was just curious. Young males sometimes are, but then he started swimming alongside us, spy-hopping, looking right at us on deck. My crewman Pete thought it was amazing, started taking pictures. The orca had followed them for nearly an hour, occasionally bumping the hull gently. Not enough to cause damage, but definitely deliberate contact. Cordova had been concerned but not alarmed. Such curious behavior, while unusual, wasn't unprecedented. "Then we hit the net," Cordova said, his voice dropping. "Not our net, someone's abandoned drift net. Illegal gear that someone had cut loose, rather than retrieving properly when the authorities were patrolling. We didn't see it until we were right on top of it, and it tangled in our propeller." What happened next had been burning in Cordova's memory for years. As they worked to free their vessel from the entangling net, they discovered something caught in it, a young female orca, already dead, wrapped so tightly in the mesh that it had cut into her skin in multiple places. "She couldn't have been dead long," Cordova recalled solemnly. "Maybe a day or two at most, and the whole time we were dealing with this situation, that male orca, Razor, Raven, whatever you want to call him, he just stayed there, circling our boat, watching everything we did. They had managed to free their vessel, and had attempted to recover the dead orca's body for proper scientific examination, as required by law. But before they could secure it, Raven had done something none of them expected. He came up underneath her body and just took her, Cordova said, still seeming amazed at the memory. Balanced her on his rostrum and swam away with her. Last we saw, he was carrying her back toward the rest of the pod. Emma exchanged glances with James, the significance of this account immediately apparent to both of them. Transport of dead pod members had been documented in several orca populations and other cetacean species, a behavior some researchers cautiously described as mourning or grief, though such terms were controversial in scientific circles. The calf, Cordova continued, couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. We reported it to the authorities, of course. Fish and Wildlife came out, took statements, collected what pieces of the net we had recovered. Don't know what came of it officially. Was the female orca from the same pod as the male who took her? Emma asked, her scientific mind immediately seeking to establish the relationship. Cordova spread his hands. Couldn't tell you for certain. I'm not trained to identify them individually like you folks are, but they were in the same general area, and he seemed concerned about her. That's the only word I can think of. This is very significant information, Mr. Cordova, Emma said carefully, especially given recent events. Do you recall anything else about the incident? Any other unusual behaviors from the male orca before or after he recovered the dead calf? Cordova thought for a moment. Just that he seemed to understand what we were doing. When we were cutting away the net, trying to free her body, he watched so intently. Not thrashing around, not aggressive, just watching like he was, evaluating our actions. The old fisherman shook his head. I know that sounds like I'm putting human thoughts in an animal's head, but that's how it felt at the time. After Cordova left, promising to write down any additional details that might come to him, Emma and James sat in thoughtful silence for several moments. If it's true, James finally said, if the orca that attacked your vessel is the same one that witnessed a young female from his pod killed by fishing gear 12 years ago, it could explain the focused nature of the encounter. Emma finished the thought. Not random aggression, but a targeted response based on prior negative association. She stood and began pacing, her mind racing with the implications. We need to confirm the historical record. There should be a report filed with NOAA or Fish and Wildlife about the dead orca. If we can establish that it was a member of Raven's pod, possibly a sibling or even an offspring, it could provide crucial context. I'll make some calls, James offered. Many of those records have been digitized now, but some from that period might still be in paper archives. Emma nodded, already typing notes into her tablet. I need to update Dr. Torres and the assessment team. This could be a significant piece of the puzzle. She paused, looking up at James. It doesn't explain everything, particularly why the behavior surfaced now after all these years, but it provides a potential framework for understanding the encounter as something more complex than simple aggression. Something more like recognized threat response, Emma supplied. If Raven associates certain types of vessels with a traumatic loss, he might have developed a generalized response that was triggered by something specific about the tour boats. Over the next several days, Emma worked with both the NOAA team and her colleagues at the research center to investigate Cordova's account. The historical records proved difficult to locate. Bureaucratic reorganizations and changes in reporting systems had scattered the documentation across multiple agencies, but eventually they found what they were looking for. A 2013 incident report describing the discovery of a dead juvenile female orca entangled in an illegal drift net near Boundary Pass. The report included photographs that Emma studied intently, looking for any distinctive markings that might help identify the pod. The images were of poor quality by modern standards, but clear enough to show the saddle patch pattern, the distinctive white marking behind the dorsal fin that helped researchers identify individual orcas. It's consistent with the T-pod markings, she confirmed during a video call with the investigation team. We can't be 100% certain without genetic analysis, but visually this appears to be a member of Raven's pod. The timing works too, added Dr. Nakamura, who had joined the investigation remotely. Based on Raven's estimated age now and the age of the deceased female in the report, she could have been his sibling, or possibly even an offspring from his first maternal group. What the report lacked was any detailed documentation of the male orca's behavior that Cordova had described, the watching, the recovery of the body. Those observations had been noted as an aside, a curious behavior that wasn't the focus of the official investigation at the time. "We're building a circumstantial case," Torres cautioned during their next in-person meeting. "It's compelling, but still speculative. We can't definitively prove that this past experience influenced the recent incidents." "No," Emma agreed, "but it provides a context that makes more sense than assuming these highly intelligent animals suddenly developed random aggression toward vessels after decades of peaceful coexistence." The investigation continued along multiple tracks. The Noé vessels maintained their monitoring of the T-pod, documenting their movements, hunting behaviors, and social interactions. The research team analyzed the acoustic recordings vessel specifications and environmental data from both the incident days and non-incident days, looking for patterns or triggering factors. And Emma immersed herself in the scientific literature on cetacean cognition, memory, and emotion. Controversial topics that straddled the line between rigorous science and anthropomorphism. The evidence for complex emotional lives in cetaceans was substantial and growing. Dolphins could recognize themselves in mirrors, suggesting self-awareness. Orcas showed distinct cultural traditions that varied between pods, and multiple whale species demonstrated behaviors consistent with grief following the death of pod members. "If we accept that orcas have long-term memory and emotional processing," Emma argued during a particularly intense discussion with the investigation team, "then the possibility that Raven associates certain vessels with a traumatic experience isn't far-fetched. It's consistent with what we know about their cognitive capabilities." "But why now?" countered one of the NOAA researchers. "If this event happened 12 years ago, why would the response be triggered specifically with these tour boats on these particular days?" It was the question that had been nagging at Emma as well, the missing piece that would make the hypothesis truly compelling. What was different about those specific encounters that might have activated a long-dormant association? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lily, who had been methodically analyzing the drone footage frame by frame, called Emma late one evening, her voice excited. "I found something," she said without preamble. "Something on the Salish Explorer that day. I didn't notice it at the time because I was focused on the orcas, but it's clear in several frames." Emma drove to the research center immediately, finding Lily hunched over her computer in the dimly lit analysis lab. "Look," Lily said, pointing to a zoomed-in section of a video frame showing the Salish Explorer from above. Draped over the portside railing was what appeared to be a fishing net, a small one, used for demonstration purposes during educational tours. "We sometimes use it to show how different mesh sizes affect bycatch," Emma recalled, leaning closer to the screen. "It's just a demonstration piece, not an actual fishing net." "But from the water, would an orca know the difference?" Lily asked. She advanced to another frame, this one showing Raven spy-hopping near the vessel, his eye level with the exact section of railing where the net was visible. The implication was clear. If Raven associated fishing nets with the traumatic loss of a pod member, the presence of even a demonstration net might have triggered a response. Not random aggression, but a specific reaction to a perceived threat. Emma quickly checked the reports from the other tour boat that had experienced unusual orca behavior. Sure enough, that vessel had also been carrying demonstration fishing gear as part of their educational materials, standard practice for many. Tour operations that included information about the region's fishing industry. "The research vessels don't carry any fishing gear, demonstration or otherwise," Emma noted, the pieces falling into place. "That's why the pod has shown no unusual behavior toward them, even when observing at closer ranges." The hypothesis gained further support when they reviewed historical records of Raven's interactions with vessels. There had been occasional reports of him approaching fishing boats more closely than other vessels, but never with the coordinated, persistent behavior they had witnessed during the incident. "It's as if something escalated," Emma theorized during the next assessment meeting. perhaps cumulative experiences with fishing gear, or some specific trigger we haven't identified yet. Torres nodded thoughtfully. If this hypothesis is correct, it has significant implications for how we manage vessel-orca interactions going forward. It's not just about distance regulations or vessel numbers, but about what those vessels are carrying and displaying. The investigation team developed a new set of recommendations. Tour boats operating in areas frequented by the T-pod should remove any fishing gear, including demonstration equipment, from visible deck areas. The hypothesis would be tested by gradually allowing tour operations to resume, first without any fishing gear visible, then potentially with controlled introductions of different equipment to observe responses. Emma found herself in the peculiar position of advocating for the perspective of the animal that had nearly killed her. During public briefings and in conversations with tour operators, she emphasized that the orca's behavior, while concerning, needed to be understood in context. These aren't mindless attacks, she explained repeatedly. If our hypothesis is correct, this is a specific response to what they perceive as a serious threat, based on prior experience. By understanding and respecting that perspective, we can coexist safely. Not everyone was convinced. Some tour operators complained about the additional restrictions, arguing that a single incident didn't justify industry-wide changes. Others went to the opposite extreme, suggesting that all vessel traffic should be prohibited in areas where the T-pod was active. Through it all, Emma maintained her balanced approach, letting the scientific evidence guide her recommendations rather than either fear or romanticized views of the animals she studied. But privately, she continued to grapple with the personal impact of the encounter. The nightmares had diminished in frequency, but still occurred occasionally, vivid dreams of dark water and powerful bodies moving around her. She found herself hesitating before entering the ocean for routine research tasks, a new anxiety she had never experienced in her years of fieldwork. James noticed her reluctance during a shoreline survey they conducted together, watching as she paused at the water's edge before wading in to check a tidal monitoring station. "It's normal, you know," he said quietly when they had returned to dry land. "Psychological responses to traumatic experiences don't follow convenient timelines." Emma sighed, frustrated with herself. "I've been in the water with orcas dozens of times throughout my career. I know the statistics, 0 fatal attacks on humans in the wild. I know the context of what happened, and yet your body remembers the fear," James finished for her. "Your rational mind and your survival instincts are in conflict. That's not weakness, Emma. It's just being human." His words stayed with her as the investigation continued into its second month. The revised management protocols had been implemented, with tour vessels now operating under strict guidelines about visible equipment, as well as approach distances. So far, there had been no further unusual encounters, though Raven and his pod had been observed in the vicinity of several tour boats without incident. Emma had declined to join any of the tour vessels herself, restricting her field observations to the NOAA research vessels. She told herself and others that this was to maintain scientific objectivity, that her presence on a tour boat might influence the orca's behavior or the data collection. It was partly true, but not the whole truth. The reality, which she admitted only to herself, was that she wasn't ready to be on a smaller vessel in close proximity to Raven again. The rational, scientific part of her mind knew the risk was minimal. The more primal part that had experienced the terror of being in the water with a massive predator wasn't so easily convinced. 5 weeks after the incident, Emma was aboard, the Soundwatch again documenting the T-pod's movements near Stewart Island. The orcas had successfully hunted a harbor seal and were engaged in their usual post-feeding socialization when the radio crackled with an incoming communication. "Soundwatch. This is tour vessel Pacific Voyager. We've got T-pod approaching, our position from the northwest, maintaining regulatory distance and protocols. Request monitoring assistance." Torres acknowledged the call and directed the helmsman to adjust course toward the reported position. Emma felt her heart rate increase slightly at the prospect of observing an interaction between the T-pod and a tour vessel, the first she would witness personally since her own encounter. As they approached, she could see the Pacific Voyager in the distance, a 45-foot catamaran specially designed for whale-watching tours, its upper deck crowded with tourists training binoculars and cameras. On the water nearby, the vessel was stationary, engines off, following the protocol for when orcas approached within observation distance. And approaching they were. Through her binoculars, Emma could see the distinctive dorsal fins of the T-pod moving directly toward the tour boat. Raven's 6-foot fin was unmistakable, leading the group in a tight formation. "Vessel confirms all fishing gear is stowed below deck," Torres reported after a brief radio exchange. "They're aware of the hypothesis and have complied with all recommendations." Emma trained the high-powered zoom lens on the approaching orcas, documenting their behavior with clinical precision despite the anxiety tightening her chest. The pod was moving purposefully but not at high speed, maintaining a steady course toward the catamaran. At approximately 200 yards from the vessel, the regulatory minimum distance, the pod slowed. 4 of the orcas paused, seemingly waiting, while Raven continued forward alone. "Single animal continuing approach," Emma reported. "Adult male T-37A, others holding position at approximately 200 yards from target vessel." Through the zoom lens, she watched as Raven approached to within 100 yards of the Pacific Voyager, half the mandated distance. There he stopped and engaged in a prolonged spy hop, his head rising vertically from the water as he observed the vessel. Emma could hear excited murmurs from the observers on the research vessel around her. This behavior, while not aggressive, was definitely unusual. A deliberate approach and inspection that suggested purposeful investigation rather than random movement. After nearly a minute of observation, Raven submerged. Tense seconds passed. As they waited to see what would happen next, would he continue the approach, move under the vessel, signal the rest of the pod to join him? Instead, Raven resurfaced at approximately 150 yards from the tour boat, turned and rejoined his waiting pod members. Together, the 5 orcas changed direction and continued on their previous course, moving away from both vessels at a leisurely pace. "That was inspection behavior," Torres said quietly beside Emma. "He was checking whether the vessel had fishing gear." "We can't know that for certain," Emma replied automatically, the scientist in her reluctant to attribute such specific motivations without more evidence. But privately, she found the interpretation compelling. Raven had approached, observed, apparently determined the vessel wasn't a threat, and departed, behavior consistent with their hypothesis about his concerns regarding fishing gear. The key encounter, brief as it was, provided valuable data for the investigation. Similar inspection behaviors were observed twice more over the next week, with different tour vessels, always following the same pattern. Raven approaching alone while the pod waited, conducting a spy hop to observe the vessel, then rejoining the pod and departing without further interaction. "He's learning," Emma suggested during the team's analysis session, updating his assessment based on new information. The implications of this interpretation were significant. If correct, it suggested not just memory and associated threat response, but active learning and adaptive behavior based on current experiences, a level of cognitive flexibility that challenged simplified views of orca behavior. As the investigation reached the 2-month mark, a clear pattern had emerged. Tour vessels that strictly adhered to the new protocols, no visible fishing gear, proper distances maintained, engines off when orcas approached within observation range, experienced only brief inspection behavior, if any interaction at all. The one vessel that had accidentally left a coil of rope visible on deck had experienced more prolonged attention, with Raven circling the boat several times before departing. "I think we have enough data to support the hypothesis," Torres announced, during what would be their final formal assessment meeting. "The behavior appears to be a specific response to perceived threats associated with fishing gear, possibly triggered by past traumatic experience. When that triggering factor is absent, the orcas show no unusual interest in vessels. The official report would recommend making the temporary protocols permanent. No fishing gear visible on any vessels operating in areas frequented by the T-pod, strict enforcement of approach distances, and continued monitoring to ensure compliance and safety. This is a significant outcome, Torres told Emma privately after the meeting, not just for understanding this specific incident, but for advancing our broader understanding of orca cognition and behavior. Your contribution has been invaluable. Emma nodded, accepting the praise professionally while feeling a complex mix of emotions. The scientific investigation had been thorough and illuminating, providing a framework for understanding what had happened that day on the water. The recommendations would likely prevent similar incidents in the future, protecting both humans and orcas. But there remained the personal dimension of the experience, the memory of being in the water with Raven, feeling his massive body beneath her, looking into his eye at close range. Whatever the scientific explanation, that encounter had changed her on a fundamental level. "I'd like to request permission to join one of the tour vessels on their next outing," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as Torres. "As an observer, to document any interactions from that perspective." Torres studied her face. "Are you sure that's wise, given your personal experience?" "No," Emma admitted with a small smile, "but it's necessary. For me, if not for the investigation." After some discussion, arrangements were made. Emma would join a scheduled tour aboard the Pacific Voyager the following week, functioning as both a scientific observer and an educational resource for the tourists. The vessel had experienced 2 of Raven's inspection approaches without incident, making it a relatively safe test case. As the day approached, Emma found her anxiety increasing. She had been on countless whale-watching vessels throughout her career, had spent thousands of hours observing orcas in the wild. Yet the prospect of being on a smaller boat in proximity to Raven again triggered a visceral response that no amount of scientific rationalization seemed to mitigate. The morning of the tour dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for whale watching. Emma arrived at the marina early, watching the preparations with an attempted professional detachment that couldn't quite mask her nervousness. Captain Sarah Chen, an experienced whale watch operator who had been supportive of the new protocols, greeted her warmly. "Dr. Larson, it's an honor to have you aboard. The passengers will be thrilled to learn from someone with your expertise." Emma managed a smile. "Thank you for accommodating me. I'm looking forward to observing your operation." As the tourists boarded, a mix of excited families, photography enthusiasts, and earnest eco-tourists, Emma found a quiet spot on the upper deck, preparing her observation equipment with methodical precision. She had come to document scientifically, she reminded herself. This was work, not therapy. Yet as the Pacific Voyager left the harbor and entered the open waters of the Salish Sea, Emma felt a growing tension in her body, an alertness that went beyond normal observational awareness. Her eyes scanned the horizon constantly, looking for the telltale sign of dorsal fins breaking the surface. The first wildlife sightings helped ease her anxiety somewhat. A group of harbor porpoises appeared off the starboard side, their small, triangular dorsal fins visible as they surfaced briefly before disappearing again. Later, they observed a magnificent bald eagle swooping down to snatch a fish from the water, its wingspan impressive against the blue sky. Emma found herself falling naturally into her role as educator, explaining marine ecology concepts to the interested tourists and answering their questions about the wildlife they were observing. The familiar territory of scientific communication provided a comfortable space that temporarily distracted from her underlying concerns. It was mid-afternoon when the call came from another vessel. T-Pod sighted near Jones Island, moving southeast, directly toward their current position. Captain Chen made a public announcement, explaining to the excited passengers that they might have an opportunity to observe orcas and detailing the protocols they would follow. The vessel would maintain the required distance, engines would be turned off if the orcas approached within observation range, and everyone should keep voices low to avoid disturbing the animals. Emma felt her heart rate accelerate as Chen positioned the vessel and cut the engines to drift quietly. The catamaran bobbed gently on the light swells as everyone aboard scanned the water in the direction the orcas had been reported. "There!" called one of the tourists, pointing to a spray of water in the distance. Through her binoculars, Emma confirmed the sighting, T-pod, 5 individuals traveling in standard formation. Her voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the anxiety churning inside her. As the orcas drew nearer, Emma could identify individuals by their distinctive dorsal fins and saddle patch patterns. Raven was easily recognizable, his tall fin with the slight rightward cant unmistakable even at a distance. He was in the lead position, with the others spread out behind him in a loose V formation. At approximately 300 yards from the vessel, the pod changed direction slightly, angling more directly toward them. Emma forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on documentation rather than memory. She noted the time, the direction, the swimming, pattern, all the details that would go into her official report. "They're approaching," Captain Chen said quietly beside her. "Standard inspection behavior?" Emma nodded. "Based on recent observations, we can expect the male to approach alone for a closer look while the others hold position. It should be brief and non-threatening." Her prediction proved accurate, to a point. As the pod reached the 200-yard regulatory boundary, 4 of the orcas paused, seemingly waiting as they had in previous encounters. Raven continued forward alone, his movements purposeful but unhurried. What was different this time was the distance. In previous inspections, Raven had approached to approximately 100 yards before spy-hopping to observe the vessel. This time, he continued closing the distance, 80 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards. "He's coming closer than in previous encounters," Emma noted, striving to maintain her clinical tone despite the tension building in her chest. At approximately 40 yards from the vessel, less than half the distance of previous approaches, Raven performed a prolonged spy hop, his head rising high above the surface as he seemed to study the catamaran. From this distance, Emma could clearly see his eye scanning the vessel, taking in the structure, the people lining the rails, the complete absence of any fishing gear on the open decks. Then, in a moment that sent a chill through her body, Raven's gaze appeared to fix directly on her. It was impossible to know if the orca could actually recognize a specific human at that distance, but Emma felt the weight of that dark eye as if they were once again just feet apart. For several long seconds, the massive predator remained partially emerged, watching. Then, with a deliberate motion, he sank beneath the surface. "Where did he go?" asked one of the tourists nervously. Emma scanned the water, looking for the telltale ripples that would indicate his direction of movement. There was nothing. The surface remained smooth in all directions. Long seconds stretched into a full minute of tense silence. The passengers and crew alike scanned the water around the vessel, waiting for Raven to reappear. His pod members remained, visible in the distance, seemingly unconcerned as they engaged in casual surface activities. Then, without warning, Raven surfaced directly alongside the catamaran, less than 20 feet from where Emma stood at the railing. Water streamed from his massive body as his dorsal fin rose to its full height beside the vessel, so close that the tourists gasped collectively at the sudden proximity. Emma froze, her body remembering the terror of being in the water with this same predator just 2 months earlier. Yet this time, there was no aggression in the encounter. Raven performed another spy hop, rising partially out of the water, his eye once again seeming to find Emma specifically among all the humans on the vessel. What happened next would become a subject of intense scientific debate and personal reflection for Emma in the weeks and months to follow. Raven submerged briefly, then reappeared on his side, his eye still visible above the water, oriented toward the vessel. He slapped his pectoral fin once against the surface, a behavior often associated with communication among orcas, before rolling upright again. Then, with a powerful stroke of his tail that sent spray across the lowest deck of the catamaran, he turned and swam directly back to his waiting pod. The 5 orcas reunited, engaged in a brief bout of surface activity that included several tail slaps and a partial breach by one of the younger animals, then continued on their original course, moving away from the vessel without looking back. The tourists erupted in excited conversation, many of them turning to Emma for explanation of what they had just witnessed. She provided the standard scientific context about inspection behavior and curiosity, while privately trying to process her own reaction to the encounter. It had felt like recognition, like acknowledgement, like closure. Science could not confirm such an interpretation. There was no way to know with certainty what motivated Raven's unusually close approach, his apparent focus on her specifically, or the fin slap that seemed directed at the vessel. Alternative explanations abounded: coincidental orientation, general curiosity about the different vessel design, social signaling intended for his pod rather than the humans. But as the Pacific Voyager made its way back to harbor, Emma felt a weight lifting that she hadn't fully acknowledged until its absence. The encounter had been on different terms, not predator and potential prey in the water, but two intelligent species observing each other with cautious respect across the boundary between their worlds. In the weeks that followed, Emma continued her research with renewed focus. The official investigation had concluded with its recommendations, implemented as permanent regulations, but there remained countless questions about Orca cognition, communication, and behavior that the encounter had highlighted. She collaborated with Dr. Nakamura on a paper comparing the San Juan incidents with the Okinawa false killer whale observations, exploring the possibility of complex communication attempts across species boundaries. The work was cutting edge, pushing at the boundaries of accepted science while maintaining rigorous methodology. Physically, Emma had recovered completely. The scrape on her leg had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless she looked for it specifically. Her shoulder no longer ached, even after long days on research vessels or hunched over computers analyzing data. The psychological healing was more complex, as trauma recovery always is. She still occasionally dreamed of dark water and massive bodies moving around her, but the dreams no longer carried the same terror. Sometimes they transformed into something more like the underwater ballet of her earlier dream, where she followed Raven's sleek form through blue depths toward some unknown destination. She had returned to the water fully, resuming her hands-on research activities without the hesitation that had plagued her immediately after the incident. The first time she had slipped into the sea again for an underwater observation session, she had felt a momentary panic, a flashback to those desperate moments trying to reach the vessel with Raven rising beneath her. But she had pushed through it, focusing on her breathing, on the scientific purpose of her work, on the beauty and mystery of the environment she had dedicated her life to understanding. 6 months after the incident, Emma stood on the observation deck of a new research vessel, the Salish Sentinel, which had replaced the sunken Explorer, watching a familiar pod of orcas hunting in the distance. Raven's distinctive fin was visible among them, his powerful body breaking the surface as he coordinated with his pod members to pursue a harbor seal. "Still think he recognizes you?" asked Lily, who stood beside her with a clipboard, documenting the hunt. Emma smiled slightly. "Science can't answer that question. We can observe behavior, document patterns, propose explanations consistent with the evidence. But the subjective experience of another species, what they perceive, how they categorize the world, whether they recognize in the way we understand the concept, that remains largely beyond our reach." She raised her binoculars, focusing on the hunt unfolding before them. The orcas moved with their usual grace and coordination, their intelligence expressed through perfect cooperation as they cut off the seal's escape routes and took turns pursuing it to exhaustion. The kill, when it came, was swift and efficient. Raven struck from below, tossing the seal into the air with a powerful upward thrust, then caught it as it fell back toward the water. The pod converged, sharing in the bounty as they always had, their social bonds reinforced through the sharing of food. When they had finished, the orcas engaged in their typical post-feeding socialization, rolling at the surface, spy-hopping, occasional breaches and tail slaps that might have been communication or simple exuberance. Raven, as usual, performed the most spectacular displays, his massive body launching clear of the water in powerful breaches that showcased his strength and agility. After one particularly impressive breach, he oriented toward the research vessel, in the distance. For a moment it seemed he might approach again, might come to inspect them as he had the tour catamaran months earlier. Instead, he rejoined his pod, and with a final, powerful stroke of his tail that sent spray glittering in, the afternoon sun disappeared beneath the surface. The entire pod moved offshore, their dorsal fins gradually receding into the distance until they vanished completely, returning to the depths that were their true home. Emma watched until the last ripple had faded from where they had been. Whatever connection had existed between her and Raven, whether born of trauma, curiosity, or something more complex that science had yet to fully understand, it had served its purpose for both of them. She had gained a deeper appreciation for the intelligence and agency of the animals she studied, a more nuanced understanding of their behavior that would inform her work for years to come. And Raven had perhaps learned that not all vessels represented the same threat, that humans, like orcas, were not a monolith, but individuals with different intentions and actions. As the research vessel turned toward harbor, Emma thought about the paper she was currently working on, an exploration of orca memory and its influence on behavior patterns. The incident with Raven was one case study among several, analyzed with scientific rigor rather than emotional projection. Yet the experience that informed her analysis went beyond what could be captured in data points and statistical significance. She had looked into the eye of one of the ocean's most powerful predators and had survived to analyze the encounter. The thin scar on her leg and the occasional dream of dark water were small prices to pay for the insight gained, the questions raised, the humility enforced about the limits of human understanding. What remained was a deep respect for the intelligence, power and mystery of these black and white hunters who shared the waters of the Salish Sea, moving through their world with a grace and purpose humans could observe but never fully comprehend. And perhaps that was as it should be. Some boundaries were meant to be maintained, even as knowledge and understanding grew on both sides. Emma turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the last light of day gilded the surface of the sea. Somewhere, in those waters, Raven continued his life, hunting, socializing, perhaps even remembering a human who had briefly entered his world and departed again. Their paths had crossed in a moment of drama and danger, then separated as the natural order reasserted itself. The ocean was vast, and they were each where they belonged. The orca in his saltwater realm, the scientist in hers, connected by a moment of contact that had changed them both in ways that neither species could fully articulate to the other. And in that unspoken understanding lay a form of communication more profound than words could capture, a recognition across the species' boundary of the other's right to exist, to thrive, to be understood on their own terms, rather than through the limited lens of human expectation. As the lights of Friday Harbor appeared in the distance, Emma closed her notebook, tucking away her observations for analysis another day. Tomorrow would bring new data, new questions, new insights. The research would continue, the understanding would deepen. But some experiences transcended scientific documentation, becoming instead a part of who she was, as a scientist, as a survivor, as a human being privileged to have glimpsed, however briefly and traumatically, the world through the eye of the ocean's apex predator. And that perhaps was the most valuable data of all.